Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Everett Ferguson Lecture in Early Christian Studies here at the Christian Scholars Conference. We're pleased that you're able to join us this afternoon. This endowed series of lectures started back in 2014 to honor the scholarship, the legacy of Professor Everett Ferguson, whom many people in this room will know well personally, but also all of us are well acquainted with his publications and the fruit of his research, his involvement with students, and his engagement in the church. It was a natural thing several years ago to put together an endowed series of lectures in his honor. Professor Ferguson's not able to be with us today, unfortunately. His wife Nancy is not very well, and they stay close to home these days. I know Everett and Nancy would covet your prayers and thoughts. We're especially appreciative, too, of the gifts and support that have come in to endow these lectures. And we've been pleased to be able to bring people to the lecture venue from various fields in early Christianity, and especially pleased today to have Robin Darling Young with us. You probably know her work. Many of you know her personally. She has published and lectured widely on various topics in early Christianity, including the reception of Scripture, the history of asceticism and monastic thought, the function of martyrdom and forming and sustaining early Christian identity and community, working on texts out of the Armenian context and the Syrian context. She's currently working on an annotated translation of the letters of Evagrius of Pontus from the surviving Syriac translation for the Fathers of the Church series. And she's heading up a translation team that's producing English translations from the Greek and Syriac texts of that father, who is such an important and influential person in ascetic theory in early Christianity. So we're looking forward to those things coming out. She has taught at a number of places. She was on faculty at Notre Dame for over 10 years. In 2013, I believe, moved back to Washington, D.C., where she's Associate Professor of Church History in the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America. Her chosen topic today, has helped set the agenda for the patristic session that we'll have tomorrow morning. So there's a slight plug on that. We'll have several presenters at that session in the morning. You can find the details in your program. The title of that is Ancient Christianity and Judaism, a Legacy of Shared Misunderstandings. That was inspired by the topic that we have before us today. Professor Young will be lecturing to us under the title, That I May Enter the Temple and Astonish the Jews, Early Christians and the Holy of Holies. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. I just looked up and realized that this is a very apposite quotation, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The temple, its furnishings, and its servants are so important in early Christianity that it never looses its grip. And I didn't realize, because Evagrius actually sort of owns what's between my ears here, I didn't realize that it might sound as if he were being controversial in the title that I submitted, because actually I have never been able to find a critical comment yet about Jews in Evagrius, which is kind of remarkable for somebody at the end of the 4th century. What he really means, and I'll just give this away right now, what he really means is, pray for me that I can become Christ. So he wants to be divinized as so many in the late 4th century did. So now just put everybody's mind at ease. We're not going to be talking about controversy between Christians and Jews. And in fact, if Greg Sterling were here, he would probably remind me that I gave a talk in which he was in the audience once, and about Evagrius, of course, and he said, "Oh, that's just all Philo." I beg to differ, but at any rate, let me begin. Begin with an illustration of the ongoing importance of the temple in our time, and this comes from a halakha by Maran, Syriac title, Rabbeinu, Hebrew, Ovadiah Yosef, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, and he died in 2014. So, of course, it comes as a question and answer. Question: is it permissible to fly in an airplane or helicopter over the Temple Mount? Answer: in the previous halakha, we have discussed the prohibition to enter the area of the Temple Mount nowadays. We had also recounted that Sir Moses Montefiore entered this area inadvertently, for he was unaware of the prohibition to do so, and there were those who wished to excommunicate him as a result. It's important to know that Sir Moses, a great Jewish philanthropist, was not, however, Shomer Shabbos. However, after Sir Moses apologized and explained that he did so innocently, the sages of Jerusalem reassured him that he need not be concerned about the excommunication he was placed in at all. So Maran, Ovadiah Yosef, writes in his responsa, I'll skip all the details, as follows: I remember hearing in my youth that Sir Moses Montefiore and his rabbi Dr. Levy entered the Temple Mount in a wooden box they were seated in while being carried by non-Jews, for they believed that there was no prohibition to enter the airspace of the Beit HaMikdash, the house of sacrifice, house of consecration, and the entire prohibition applied to walking on the ground of the Temple Mount. Nice distinction. Based on the above, if the assumption of Sir Moses was correct that there is no prohibition to enter the Beit HaMikdash while in a box, it would seem to be permissible to fly over the place of the Beit HaMikdash in a helicopter as well, since one is not actually walking on the earth of the Beit HaMikdash and is merely taking a tour in its airspace. Nevertheless, Maran proves from the words of the great Rishonim, Shavuot 17a, that the airspace of the Beit HaMikdash was likewise sanctified along with the Beit HaMikdash itself. Thus, it is actually forbidden to enter the Temple Mount while riding within a box, or to fly over it in a plane or helicopter. For by doing so, one passes through the airspace of the Temple Mount, all of whose area we are concerned may have been the actual location of the Beit HaMikdash, and the sanctity of the Beit HaMikdash continues up to the sky. What Sir Moses Montefiore did was contrary to halakha, as he himself apologized for later, after having realized that he was misled with opinions among the poskim that were halakhically rebuffed. So, this is a very recent ruling, and in fact, it still applies. The jets of the Israeli Air Force are not allowed to fly over the space of the Temple Mount. Rabbeinu goes on to say, as a side point, and this touches what I'm going to talk about later, an issue related to this is Kohanim, priests, flying over the airspace of cemeteries. Wait, what priests, you say? Indeed, there are authorities who prohibit Kohanim to fly on planes when there is a possibility it will be flying over cemeteries, for they may not pass over the impurity of a corpse. Nevertheless, regarding a Kohen's impurity, there is indeed room for leniency, for there are several doubts that can be combined. Perhaps the plane will not even fly over a cemetery, and even if it does, perhaps the graves are of non-Jews, whose graves do not cause impurity in their airspace, which is likewise a doubt regarding impurity in a public domain which is permitted, among several other reasons. However, regarding the Temple Mount, flying over any area of the Temple Mount is forbidden, as we have explained. And then he adds his final sentence. May Hashem hasten our final redemption, so that we may merit seeing the third Beit HaMikdash in all its glory, perched atop the mountain of Hashem for all eternity. Amen. Well, here we see a living connection to the love of the temple and the priesthood among contemporary Israeli Haredi Jews. The person who gave this opinion is called Maran because he is not only Sephardic, he's from Iraq, and therefore he would have spoken Aramaic. But the way the temple is construed in ongoing halakhic Judaism means that there is a continued observance of special laws for a temple that no longer stands, but still exists and will exist again. There are special laws for Kohanim, priests, and Leviim, Levites. Laws here are significant as an act of consecration, even when the place they governed no longer survives. The absence of the temple may have intensified the love of the temple. Already we see that the lack of sacrifice in the Hellenistic diaspora may have been underlined because of the emphasis in Second Temple Judaism, and particularly in Deuteronomy, because of the emphasis on the necessity of the one site and the one building of the temple. There's only one and no others. There are forms of sacrifice that still exist. The temple still exists as not only a shadow but a hope, and they continue to exist in early Christianity. There is much to be said about this, and I direct you to the wonderful book In the Shadow of the Temple, which has to do with the temple in early Christianity, and how it continues to be debated. But what then of Christianity? There is in early Christianity a constant and tense dialogue between early Christian authors and the temple in Jerusalem. Of course, we know of the dialogue, sometimes very heated and bitter, between Christian authors and Jewish authors. And of course, if you read the Jewish authors of Babylon, who were free to write their opinions, you can see return serves in the same spirit. This dialogue is informed and shaped already by disagreements in the Second Temple that both glorified and, among some people, rejected the temple. Surely the temple does not survive in Christian memory and practice, or does it? It's my privilege today, for which I am very grateful, especially to you, Jeff, to honor the work of Everett Ferguson, and particularly his interest in the wider backgrounds of early Christianity, by discussing one stream of interpretation of the temple and the priesthood, that of the Alexandrians. First Philo, and then two of his heirs, the teachers and interpreters in the city of Alexandria and its surrounding schools from the early 3rd to the late 4th century. And the interpretation of the temple that they accomplished, even in its absence, ranged from the meaning of the structure, its decoration, its ceremonies, the personnel of the visible temple in Jerusalem, and by extension to the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, both pre-existing Jewish pilgrimage and then later Christian pilgrimage, to the significance of the heavenly liturgy and the cherubim throne of God, his Merkavah, to the significance of the priestly kingdom that is also the church with its priests, not just the ordained, in which the priesthood is seen to be primarily resting in the person of the bishop, but the priesthood shared out among all Christians, the priesthood of all believers. I'm going to end with a discussion of the priesthood of all believers, so I just want to mark it as an important important thought. And I also want today to focus on the understanding of priesthood, and particularly the garments of the priesthood, as an additional tribute to my recently deceased University of Chicago professor, Jonathan Z. Smith, and his wonderful article, The Garments of Shame, from 1966, which all erupted from his reading of the Gospel of Thomas, Logion 37, which gospel had been discovered in 1956. That was a generative article, and it's sort of continued to inspire me throughout my career, particularly my career in institutions where priesthood is believed to be highly restricted. The temple had already been seen well before the Alexandrians as an earthly rendition of a heavenly reality, a reflection of the throne of God, and an access point to the secrets of his kingdom. We have only to think of the Qumran document, the Song of the Sabbath Sacrifice. How do Christians understand their own gatherings as an extension of the temple, and what does this mean for them? Especially, perhaps, although I'm not going to touch on this today, in the context of the ongoing and sometimes ferocious argumentation with Jews. Christian authorities had to work hard to counter the impression in their communities that holiness belonged to the first people of God. Think here of Irenaeus, of Origen, and then later, more heatedly, Chrysostom and Ephraim. But in this early period, that is in the 1st and 2nd century, there was still so much overlap of book, interpretation, building, whether present or absent, symbol, and even people, that there was often a default admission that they shared much. Certainly this is true for Origen, and as well for his predecessor Clement, and then even into the late 4th century, where borrowings and rejections went hand in hand. There was no way for Christianity to lose the temple and the priesthood. The only avenue that was open to it was to interpret it. Now, as I've said, this is a vast topic, and I really want to just talk about garments and the meaning of garments with respect to the temple that continues to be present with early Christians, basically because they want it to be so. But nobody who deals with this topic can do so without referring to Philo. And here I want to recommend, if you haven't seen it already, Mara Niehoff's new book on Philo of Alexandria, An Intellectual Biography, which is very interesting. She tracks a development in Philo's thinking on the temple, which is actually a development that is mirrored in early Christianity. Why? Well, because early Christians take over the library of Philo. So for Philo, the temple is both an actual physical site and a place in the soul. His early writings emphasize the latter, that the temple is a place in the soul. Because when Philo was writing his early biblical interpretation, he was very strongly Platonist. And so ascent to the temple required a certain ethical discipline, which then could prepare the way for contemplation, and contemplation was a form of temple service for Philo. His early writings, his later writings, however, emphasize the importance of the actual temple. Think of his Legatio, for instance. After the Romans, and particularly the Emperor Caligula, threatened the temple, and with Caligula it was threatening further profanation of the temple, Niehoff writes that the temple is the central venue of honoring God throughout the universe, and as a whole is a more perfect and holy temple, but the celestial temple, which begins with a place in the soul, is holier, rendering purely ethereal service to God. The best and also the purest, holiest, and pious form of worship is to venerate with purity, sincerity, and innocence of mind and speech. After Caligula, when Philo comes to realize the threat to the land of Judea and to the temple itself, a threat which would be realized 30 years later with its destruction, Philo begins to endorse pilgrimage, the actual practice of pilgrimage, because it tests the true intentions of a faithful Jew. It defines Jewish identity for Philo. So, in other words, Philo sort of comes back to the Deuteronomic position. Niehoff connects Philo's thinking about the temple to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2. It's written not much later, of course, again, only those fateful 30 years, where, she says, Jesus shows both his exceptional wisdom and his true commitment to God. And she writes, not in a kind of Philonic vein, but she writes, commenting on Luke, going up to the Jerusalem temple and rejoicing in its intellectual opportunities, he transforms himself from a talented boy into a religious leader. Well, we remember what it says in Luke 2, 41 to 52, which is the section about Jesus losing his parents, so to speak, and going into the temple. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, quote, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. Kathed zomenon and mezoton didaskalon, kai akuonta auton, kai eperotonta autus. There was a question and a response in the temple. Of course, this is for Evagrius where Jesus astonishes the Jews, because after all, he's a little boy. Now, I'm going to simply skip over the places, all the many places in second century Christianity, not to mention the New Testament, where the temple is discussed either positively or negatively. But if I were to go through those places, I think I could show that the temple and the appropriateness of the person to serve the temple or to rule the temple is at the crux of New Testament interpretation of the life of Jesus. And I think I could also show that the concern with priesthood and who is the proper priest in early Christianity begins to be extended not only, of course, to hereditary priests, but also on the basis of, among other passages, 1 Peter 2, 4 through 10, I think I could show that the concept of priesthood begins to extend to women also. So I'll just kind of gesture, as they like to say, to one passage. But remember that 1 Peter 2, 4 says, come to him, to that living stone, rejected by men, but in God's sight, chosen and precious. And the passage ends with, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, that you may declare the wonderful deeds of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were, said to the Gentiles, no people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. This text Perhaps not so important out of all the texts of the New Testament is, however, the text that I believe underlies the depiction of women in a priestly way in early Christianity. And as I said, since this is just a gesture, I will mention only Perpetua, in not only in her intercession for the cleansing of her brother, but in her vision. And I will mention also Macrina of the 4th century, who participated in this Philonic tradition whereby priesthood resides in the ethical sphere and resides in the mind. That is the enlightened mind. Now, the first place in which priesthood becomes extremely important is in Clement, Book 5 of the Stromataes. But the Stromataes throughout is a priestly book, because what Clement wants to do is to show, among many other things, because yes, David is laughing there, because Clement is eclectic, deliberately eclectic and obscure, but he's obscure for a purpose. Clement believes that the Gnostic sage is the true priest. And he goes to great lengths to demonstrate this in a rather wandering way in Book 5, where he talks about the robe of the priest. Now, you might think, and I could be engaged in argument on this, that this is kind of a dead end, because Clement is so abstruse and wandering and eclectic. However, I think it is not, and I think the Clementine interpretation is extremely important in early Christianity. His ideas, if not his style, carry forward. But I want to just mention 2 passages. One, at the beginning of Book 5, where Clement says, "Now the high priest's robe is the symbol of the world of sense. The 7 planets are represented by the 5 stones and the 2 carbuncles." I'm not going to go on for long in this vein. "For Saturn and the moon," etc. And cooperating, as they did, in the production of things here below, those that by divine providence are set over the planets, not clear who he's talking about, is it? Angels. Are rightly represented as placed on the breast and shoulders, and by them was the work of creation the first week. And the breast is the seat of the heart and soul. Differently, the stones might be the various phases of salvation, some occupying the upper, some the lower parts of the entire body saved. The 360 bells suspended from the robe is the space of a year, quote, "the acceptable year of the Lord, proclaiming and resounding the stupendous manifestation of the Savior." Furthermore, the broad gold mitre indicates the regal power of the Lord, since the head of the church is the Savior. That's enough for that passage. Clement goes on and on. However, the robe, symbolic as it is and potent as it is, exists only to make possible the passage to the knowledge of God. It makes it possible for the priest, and it makes it possible for the priest who is Gnostic sage, whom he teaches. And I think I should just make a footnote here and say, by Gnostic, I mean not dualist Gnostic of bad reputation, but sage. Clement used the word Gnostic without apology and in a polemical way against those dualists in order to rescue the term, which Paul had used, of course, for teachers of the church. So Paul is here talking about interpreting the high priesthood as a teacher of the church. And they say, he goes on in Stromataes 5, that the robe prophesied the ministry in the flesh by which he was seen in closer relation to the world. This is the high priest. So the high priest, putting off his consecrated robe, The universe and the creation in the universe were consecrated by him, assenting that what was made was good. He washes himself and puts on the other tunic, a holy of holies one, so to speak, which is to accompany him into the aditum. That's the Holy of Holies, exhibiting, as seems to me, the Levite and Gnostic, again, Gnostic understood in Clement's way, as the chief of other priests, those bathed in water and clothed in faith alone and expecting their own individual abode, himself distinguishing the objects of intellect from the things of the sense, rising above other priests, hastening to the entrance to the world of ideas, to wash himself from the things here below, not in water, as formerly one was cleansed on being enrolled in the tribe of Levi, but purified already by the sage, the Gnostic word, in his whole heart, and thoroughly regulated, and having improved that mode of life received from the priest to the highest pitch, and being quite sanctified both in word and life, and having put on the bright array of glory, I'm not kidding, this is one sentence, and received the ineffable inheritance of that spiritual and perfect man, which eye has not seen, and ear has not heard, and it has not entered into the heart of man, and having become son and friend, he is now replenished with insatiable contemplation, face to face. About whom is Clement speaking here? He is speaking about Jesus and also about the Gnostic. But the important thing that I want to point out is that Clement speaks of the importance of the priestly robe. The robe understood as an actual garment, but as a garment that is so laden with symbols that it enables the trained and knowing wearer to bring enlightenment in the manner of Christ and himself to be enlightened. This is a priesthood for Clement which has little to do with the rising office of bishop at the end of the 2nd century. And although Clement is much more loquacious, much less terse than Origen, Origen himself is of the same mind. Origen says less about the priesthood per se, but if you read his homilies on Leviticus, you can pick up the same idea, that the priesthood is located in the teaching sage of the church. What happens to this idea? Well, we know that Basil of Caesarea writes about the priesthood, and of course Gregory of Nazianzus, and after him John Chrysostom write about the priesthood, and they're writing essentially about the office of the bishop, although Gregory Nazianzus does also believe in the superior importance of the noumenal world, and he does also believe that the priesthood is shared among those who are philosophical teachers in the church. But what I would like to do is turn now to the interpretation of the priestly clothing on the part of the person whom I work upon most, namely Evagrius of Pontus, who is the first Christian writer to give a complete account of the transcendent referent of monastic clothing. Ascetic and philosophical writer that he was resident and teacher in the monastic community of Kelia for 15 years until his death. He presented the wearing of clothing and the knowledge of its proper interpretation as a vital part of the transformation of the human being into a person ready to return to her or his pre-material origin, namely God, but also at the same time to be prepared to teach others who also were called to return to God. Now, Evagrius spent only the last 15 years of his life in Kelia, in Egypt, southeast of Alexandria. And he had a career which, before that, which I believe was very successful, but which he obscured after he became a monk. So we don't know very much about it. He is, however, such a learned person that it's impossible to believe that he was not a teacher before he became consultor to the great Gregory of Nazianzus during the period of the Council of Constantinople in 381. But after that time, and when he went to Egypt to become a monk and a teacher, he concentrates his tremendous talent on establishing works, on writing works primarily for that audience. And what he does is to take the thought of Philo and to, yes, Greg, wherever you are, he takes the thought of Philo and he takes the thought of Clement and puts it in another form while retaining much of its emphasis. He also believes that women are able to be sages and priests in the sense in which he uses the term. And so he writes in an early letter to Melania, the friend of Rufinus and perhaps an abbess of a monastery in Jerusalem. Now, Evagrius speaks about garb in two places. And mainly those places are in the Praktikos, which is a work about ethics, and then in the Kephalia Gnostica. But actually remarks about clothing are sprinkled throughout his works. He wishes to discuss monastic clothing to link his thought with earlier monastic authors' thought about clothing, those authors particularly in the tradition of Anthony. But he understands clothing much more philosophically than any previous monk did, and he believes that clothing is a kind of, it's an inadequate word, but sacrament. Inasmuch as for Evagrius, clothing is a symbolon, a symbol understood in its full sense, that which conveys what it seems to be. For Evagrius, clothing is a sign of the reversal of the fall of Adam and Eve, but which for Evagrius, in his own tradition, really signifies the fall of rational souls from union with the divine into bodilessness, and their return to union with the divine, with God, by reclothing, a theme which in the Christian tradition, of course, goes back to Philippians 2, and also the hymn of the pearl, though Evagrius may not have been aware of the latter, as he may not also have been aware of Logion 37 of the Gospel of Thomas. When Evagrius transmits his interpretation of priestly garments, he does so for a particular purpose, to make it possible for his reader to gain power, dunamis, through these instruments of clothing, to reach a particular goal. You can see in the first 4 sentences of Evagrius's On Prayer how he introduces his reader to the complex connection between sacred objects and clothing, ancient priestly standing, and the monastic contemplative. So I'm going to read them to you. If someone should wish to prepare fragrant incense, he will combine, according to the law, pure frankincense, cassia, onycha, and myrrh in equal amounts, Exodus 30, 34 to 35. These refer to the four primary virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, and courage, from Protagoras 330b. For if they are fully and equally present, the mind, the nous, will not be betrayed. Number 2, when the soul has been purified by the full complement of the virtues, it stabilizes the attitude of the mind and prepares it to receive the desired state. The word is katastasis, referring to the state of a mind before God, created mind before God. 3, prayer is a communion of the mind with God. What sort of state does the mind need so that it can reach out to its Lord without turning back and commune with him without intermediary? Here, see Clement Stromate 739, and a couple of pagan authors too. 4, if Moses, so going back before the temple, but of course there are connections here. If Moses, when he tried to approach the earthly burning bush, was held back until he removed the sandals from his feet, Exodus 3:5, how can you, who wish to see and commune with the one who is beyond all representation and sense perception, not free yourself from every mental representation tied to the passions? That is a tall order. Now, in this passage, Evagrius has bracketed a discussion of the mind by 2 interpretive kephalaia that connect the praying ascetic with Moses. Throughout numerous works, but particularly in his biblical scholia, Evagrius casts Moses as an example of the praktike because of his transmission of the law. So what is the praktike? The praktike is practice, overcoming evil habits and substituting good habits for them. Moses, he says, was the author of the book of nature as the composer of the Pentateuch and as a friend of Christ, making him, in effect, an ancient example of the same ascetic contemplation that Evagrius had found in Clement and in Origen. But much more pointedly, the Kephalaia Gnostica, Evagrius's deliberately obscure collection of sentences for meditation, established the priestly action and garments as a model for the contemplative ascetic, male and female, by the way. This is a collection of 6 centuries of philosophical and exegetical sentences. Intended for ascetics who were now able, with their vices restrained, to engage in 2 ascending levels of contemplation of the natural world, culminating in the return of the mind to God. The latter state, which was beyond words, Evagrius can only describe by analogy. But the approach to the invisible, the heavenly temple, he does describe in an exegesis of passages from Exodus. The kephalaia concerning the priest's garments and on the furnishings of the temple with their allegorical explanations are as follows. So bear with me. This is my translation from the expurgated version of the Syriac. In other words, the unexpurgated, in other words, the restored Syriac translation from the Greek. Exodus 28:4. The intelligible turban is faith, unwavering and incapable of fear. The intelligible rosette is the knowledge of the Holy Trinity. The intelligible ephod is the state of the rational soul in which a person customarily serves its virtues. The mercy seat is spiritual knowledge that leads the souls of those who serve. The breastplate is the hidden knowledge of God's mysteries, that is, the mysteries of creation. The intelligible robe is the spiritual teaching that gathers those who have gone astray. The intelligible undergarment is the mortification of the concupiscible part, which the desiring part of the person. That's all of the person, not just one area, which comes about for the sake of the knowledge of God. The intelligible ephod is the soul's righteousness by which a person is customarily made illustrious by deeds and by blameless teachings. Now I'm going to skip over a couple of these. Evagrius understands the Christian priest to be like a Nazarite. Well, he would. He's an ascetic, right? So if the anger of dragons is wine, Deuteronomy 32:33, and the Nazarites abstain from wine, Numbers 6:3, it follows that the Nazarites are commanded to be without anger. The mind is named the head of the soul, and the virtues are the sign of the hair. When he is deprived of this, think of Samson, the Nazarite will be separated from knowledge and led away bound by his enemies. Who are the enemies but the thoughts prompted by demons? The high priest is the one who supplicates God on behalf of the entire rational nature, and he separates some from wickedness and others for ignorance. The spiritual sacrifice is the pure conscience, which is placed on the state of the mind as on an altar. The final kephalion, number 90, so the final one for the entire work, reads, "Whoever is made worthy of spiritual knowledge will assist the holy angels and will bring back the rational beings from vice to virtue and from ignorance to knowledge. Examine our words, our brothers, and explain with diligence the symbols of the centuries and the number of the 6 days of creation." This line has led some people to think that this entire work is a kind of hexaemeron. The Gnostikos, as a monk, is an assistant to the angels, who themselves assist ascetic practitioners as they seek to return to the original state of the created mind. And thus, the Gnostikos, like the high priest, is able to pass from the material world of bodies and social exchanges to the noetic world containing for contemplation the logoi of the world and all visible realities. Such an accomplished female ascetic could also fill such a role as Evagrius thought Melania did. The difference between the male and female ascetic pronounced at the level of the community and less advanced solitaries, according to Evagrius, seems to disappear when women have become accomplished practitioners and Gnostikoi. So Evagrius understands the garments of the high priest as really transcendent realities. You might say that, like the Jews who composed the Mishnah after the temple was gone but still practiced the motions of the high priest, find their echo in Evagrius, who understands the garment of the high priest as one leading into the realm of God. But Evagrius also thinks about another kind of clothing. Lest you think that his head was in the clouds all the time, it wasn't. He actually has a very elaborate interpretation of the clothing of the beginning monk, which he calls a symbolic schema. The word schema can now mean a monastic robe, but it meant an arrangement then, and it has that echo. He believes that these have a precedent in 1 Corinthians 3, 4-1, Philippians 2, and Ephesians 5. And he connects the clothing of the monk with its corresponding invisible reality. Now, you find the 10 Kephalia, where he talks about monastic clothing, at the very beginning of his work for beginning monks, namely the Practicos. And he, in the interest of time, I'm just going to go directly to that page. And he links the first 10 schema, the 10 Kephalia, the description of the schema, with the last 10, which are tributes to his teachers, including Gregory Nazianzus, Basil, Athanasius, etc. He lists 6 items in this schema and lists them from the head down. They are the kukoulion, or the hood, the uncovered hands and lower arms, the analobos, the belt tightened around the kidneys, the melote, or sheepskin, and the staff. For Evagrius, contrary to what you might have thought from his allegorical interpretation of the priest's garments, salvation begins with the body. It begins with its position and covering. This is where practice in the moral life must start. Each part of the clothing had a particular symbolic and immediate function, and a biblical quotation pertained to each one. So we can imagine this clothing as also having a biblical quotation inscribed invisibly on it. So what is the kukoulion? I won't go through every one, but the kukoulion is the hood of the ascetic, and he says it is a symbol of grace. Its function is to protect the hegemonikon, the part of our mind that we make decisions with, and to warm up the monk's infancy in Christ. It's like swaddling a baby. The monk is not only like a baby needing swaddling, but also like the newly baptized. And Evagrius makes a connection between baptismal garments and monastic clothing. They are in danger, those who wear these clothes, both from the attacks of demons, quote, who are always trying to strike and wound them, and from their attitude and bad habits. The danger is not only external, but internal, because those who wear the kukoulion, says Evagrius, are required to sing Psalm 126:1. So clothing goes with psalms, wherein the words themselves from the Septuagint instill humility and uproot hyperephania, pride, the ancient arrogance, the ancient evil that cast on earth, quote, Lucifer who rose near the dawn. This is a complex paragraph, and I don't think I've done it justice, but Evagrius combines physical items, envisioned states, and biblical quotations to connect biblical episodes through a piece of physical piece of clothing, to the body it touches, and within the body to the mental state itself. The symbol that Evagrius is talking about stretches from the past through the body of the monk to his future or her future destination as a mind reunited to God. The next piece of clothing is actually an absence, namely the requirement to bare the hands. You've seen these icons or illuminations of monks with bare hands. These naked hands, he says, make clear the honest state of the monastic politeia. Here Evagrius speaks of life in common, not just the way of life of one particular monk. I believe there's a comment on Plato and Plato's politeia here, but I'm not going to go into it at the moment. But Evagrius discusses the necessity for honesty in the politeia, that is, not to lie. Then the zone, the belt tightened around the kidneys. The kidneys were believed in the ancient world to be a source of sexual activity, which was forbidden in Philo to the priest, of course, temporarily, or the ascetic in Christian authors beginning with Origen. Evagrius then goes back to Philo's interpretation of Exodus 12:11, which he, Philo, read as the disappearance or drying up of the passions. Now, I will skip over here, although I'm perfectly happy to send this to you if you want to, get the exact quotations. I'll skip over the melote, the goat skin, and the staff, which recalls the staff of Moses. He summarizes, Evagrius, the ensemble of the monastic garb as, quote, the pragmata, the realities, of which the habit monastic habit, the schema, is a symbol. He further identifies the scriptural quotations and the instructions as the words which the fathers are always saying to them, the monks. He presents an upward path to, quote, theology and ultimate blessedness as the results of steps stretching from fear of God through faith, abstinence, perseverance, and hope, apatheia, or calm, and love. The final paragraph of the prologue declares that the following discussion, from the 100 chapters on the practical life to the 50 in addition to the 600 on the Gnostic life, has been condensed and divided up. So the form of the Kephalaia itself is another kind of symbolon, a compressed teaching meant to open out in front of the reader who is following the rules for the practice. Evagrius believes that the Gnostic had to teach, the sage had to teach what he taught at the right time to the right people. This he shares with Clement, Philo, and Origen. So in the epilogue, Evagrius presents these to his friend Anatolius, to whom he dedicates the treatise, as encoded. We have kept some things hidden and have obscured others, so as not to give what is holy to dogs and throw pearls before swine. Matthew 7:6. But these things will be clear to those who have dedicated themselves to being engaged in their track, that is, to following along the symbols. For Evagrius is priesthood. Priesthood is the practice of commandments, practice of the commandments, but it depends upon a knowledge of what those commandments are for and a direction toward contemplation. And as a direction toward contemplation, which ultimately must turn back and teach others, it is the highest and real form of priesthood in the church. I will skip over what Evagrius says about bishops. And I believe that in this, Evagrius anticipates what another teacher, but one with considerably less calm, if Evagrius did have calm, said when he objected to the distinction between temporal and spiritual orders. For whoever comes out of the water of baptism can boast that he is already a consecrated priest, bishop, and pope, although, of course, it is not seemly that just anybody shall exercise such office. And you know, of course, that I am referring to Martin Luther and his revival of the belief in the priesthood of all believers, one which I think Evagrius extended to those who were capable of bearing it, male and female. Thank you.